The world was nothing but teeth, and Jedediah Kane was riding right into the mouth of it. Snow wasn't falling, it was hunting. Each flake a tiny shard of glass driven by a wind that wanted to peel the skin from his bones. He hunched low over his horse, the greatcoat a stiff, useless shield. Frost had claimed his hair, his beard, turning him into some wild winter ghost. But ghosts don't bleed, and Jedediah was bleeding. The gash on his forearm, a gift from a rustler's blade, had frozen into a black crust. Beneath his coat, his ribs screamed with every ragged breath, a souvenir from a bullet that had glanced off and kept going. He'd driven them off, sure, but they'd left their mark. Stopping wasn't an option. Out here, stopping meant the cold would finish what the lead had started. He was a big man, shoulders built to carry the weight of a hard life, but right now he felt small. The plains were an endless white ocean, and he was just a man in a sinking boat, riding for a shore he wasn't sure he'd reach. That's when he saw it, a flicker of movement against the blinding white. Not an animal, something small, something struggling. He squinted, his eyelashes caked with ice. It was a person, a girl maybe, stumbling through drifts that came up to her waist, fighting a losing battle against the storm. She was clutching a small leather satchel to her chest, like it was the only thing keeping her heart beating. His first thought was trap. The plains were full of them. A pretty face to lure you in, and a knife in the ribs to send you on your way. He'd seen it before. He slowed his horse, his hand hovering near the pistol at his hip. But then she fell. She went down hard, a small, dark shape swallowed by the snow. And she didn't get up. Something inside him, something older than suspicion, broke loose. With a curse that turned to smoke in the air, he swung his leg over the saddle. His boots sank deep, the cold biting instantly through the worn leather. Each step toward her was a fresh agony in his side, but he kept going. He reached her and knelt down. Her face was pale as the snow itself, her lips a faint blue, but her eyes, when they fluttered open, were fierce. They were the eyes of something that refused to die. "You'll freeze out here," he rasped, his voice a gravelly ruin. "My horse," she whispered, the words cracking. "It fell." He looked back the way she'd come. 100 yards back, a dark mound was already being buried by the storm. A horse. Gone. A familiar pang of loss hit him. In this life, you lost things. Horses, family, hope. It was all the same in the end. "You alone?" he asked. She gave a single tight nod, her jaw clenched to keep her teeth from chattering. He looked at her, really looked. 17, maybe 18, a child. But there was a hardness in her gaze that didn't belong on a child's face. Survival had already left its fingerprints all over her. "Come on," he said, not waiting for an answer. He hooked an arm under hers and pulled her to her feet. "My cabin's not far." She didn't fight him. She didn't have the strength. He half carried, half dragged her back to his horse. Lifting her into the saddle sent a fresh wave of fire through his ribs, but he gritted his teeth and swung up behind her. He wrapped one arm around her waist to hold her steady and turned the horse toward home. The wind howled, a physical thing that tried to tear them from the saddle. She was shivering so hard he could feel it through his thick coat. Then she leaned back against him, just a fraction, a silent plea for warmth he couldn't deny. He didn't speak. Words were useless against a storm like this. The shape of his cabin finally appeared through the white haze, a dark, low-slung promise of shelter. Smoke trickled from the chimney, a thin gray prayer answered. He practically fell off the horse, his strength gone. He helped her down and got the door open, pushing her into the relative warmth inside. The air smelled of pine smoke and solitude. He guided her to the hearth, where a few embers still glowed, and then shrugged off his greatcoat. The movement tore the gash on his arm open again. Blood, dark and shockingly red against his pale skin, welled up and dripped onto the floorboards. She gasped. "You're hurt." Her voice was still a whisper, but it wasn't fear he heard in it. It was something else, something he hadn't heard directed at him in a long, long time. Rustlers, he grunted, kneeling to coax the fire back to life. Got the better of them, but they got a piece of me. Without a word, she dropped the leather satchel she'd been clutching and fumbled it open. He expected her to pull out a bit of food, maybe a worn blanket. But that's not what happened. She pulled out a small, oilskin-wrapped bundle. She unwrapped it with shaking, frozen fingers. Inside weren't biscuits or jerky. Inside was a surgeon's kit. Not a fancy one, but a practical one. Rolled bandages, clean as could be. A small bottle of clear liquid. Dried herbs that filled the small cabin with a sharp, clean scent. And a needle and gut thread, sterilized and ready. Her hands were trembling, but her movements were sure. "I know a little," she said, her eyes fixed on his arm. "Enough to keep it from festering." He hesitated. He hadn't let anyone tend to his wounds in years. Trust was a currency he couldn't afford to spend. But looking at her, at the fierce concentration on her face, he found himself extending his arm. Her touch was icy cold, but incredibly gentle. She cleaned the wound with the liquid, her lips pressed into a thin line. She ground the herbs with a little water from the kettle and made a poultice, spreading it carefully over the gash. He watched her, fascinated. This wasn't a scared girl stumbling through the snow. This was someone who had seen worse things than a blizzard. "You've done this before," he said. It wasn't a question. Her eyes met his for a split second, and in them he saw a flash of a story so dark he almost didn't want to know the end. "Had to," she whispered, looking away. He didn't push. He knew that tone of voice. It was the sound of a door slamming shut on a room full of ghosts. When the bandage was tied clean and tight, she sat back on her heels, the adrenaline finally leaving her. She looked exhausted, fragile again, but he knew better now. That fragility was a mask. The silence in the cabin was broken only by the crackle of the growing fire and the scream of the wind outside. He felt her presence in the room like a weight he hadn't realized he'd been missing until this very moment. "You're Cain," she said suddenly. It sounded like an accusation. He stiffened, his good hand clenching into a fist. "Jedediah Cain." "People talk," she murmured, not looking at him, just staring into the flames. "They say you're dangerous, that you keep to yourself because you killed men, that no one dares cross you." He let out a dry, humorless chuckle that sounded like rocks grinding together. "Folks like stories more than they like the truth." The silence came back, heavier this time. He could feel her thinking, weighing the stories against the man who had just saved her life. Finally, her voice came, so quiet he almost missed it. "I don't have anywhere else to go." The words landed in the center of the room and stayed there. He looked at her properly then. The worn, thin coat, the stubborn set of her jaw, the way she clutched that strange satchel even now. A girl with a surgeon's kit and nowhere to go. It didn't add up. None of it did. "Name?" he asked, his voice rougher than he intended. "Rosalind," she said. "Rosalind Hart." He nodded once, a slow, deliberate movement. "Stay the night. Storm'll kill you otherwise." She gave a tiny nod, a barely perceptible dip of her chin, and edged closer to the fire, pulling the satchel onto her lap. As the night wore on, the shadows in the cabin grew long and deep. He threw another log on the fire, the flames dancing and throwing strange shapes on the walls. He tried not to think about other winters, other fires, another small person sitting by the hearth, a boy with his mother's eyes and a laugh that could chase away the deepest cold, a memory that felt like a knife in his gut. He laid a spare quilt on the floor for her. She took it without a word. He stretched out on his bunk on the far side of the room, turning to face the wall. But sleep wouldn't come. He could hear her soft, uneven breathing. He knew she was awake too. The cabin was filled with the things they weren't saying. Later, in the dead of night, he heard her whispering. He turned his head just slightly, ashamed of eavesdropping but unable to help himself. He thought she was praying, but the words he caught weren't prayers for rescue. They were strange. She was whispering names he didn't recognize, and numbers. A long string of numbers over and over, like she was trying to burn them into her memory. He lay there in the dark, a cold dread seeping into his bones that had nothing to do with the storm outside. This girl wasn't just lost, she was running. And whatever she was running from, it was bad enough to make her whisper secrets to a dying fire in the middle of a blizzard. The first hint of dawn was a pale gray line at the edge of the shutters. Jedediah rose, his body stiff and aching. He moved to the door and opened it a crack to check the weather. The snow had stopped. The world was a pristine, unbroken sheet of white under a sky the color of slate. But he wasn't looking at the sky. He was looking at the horizon, and what he saw made his blood run cold. Dark shapes, moving against the white. Too many to be deer, too organized to be random travelers. They were riders, and they weren't just passing through. They were spreading out, forming a search line. He shut the door softly, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against his wounded ribs. The rustlers, they hadn't given up. They'd come back to finish the job. Behind him, Rosalind stirred. She sat up, rubbing the sleep from her eyes. She looked at him, a silent question on her face. He held her gaze for a long moment. He saw the girl from the storm, the skilled medic, the whisperer of secrets. He saw the fire in her eyes that refused to be put out, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the core, that he was wrong. Those riders weren't looking for him. They were looking for her. "We've got trouble," he said, his voice low and steady. "And it's coming fast." The morning light was thin and weak, slicing through the single window and painting stripes across the rough-hewn floor. Jedediah didn't bother with coffee. He sat at the table, the rhythmic rasp of a whetstone against his knife, the only sound in the cabin. Scrape, scrape, scrape. A sound that said he was getting ready for a fight. Behind him, Rosalind moved with a quiet purpose that unnerved him. She was no longer the half-frozen girl he'd pulled from the snow. The storm had scoured away her fear, leaving something harder and brighter in its place. She was pouring water into a basin, the steam rising to veil her face. He'd seen those riders on the ridge. They'd swept the area where he found her, their movements methodical, predatory. Then, just as suddenly as they'd appeared, they'd vanished. Scouts, maybe. But scouts for what army? He hadn't told her. He hadn't told her they weren't his rustlers. He hadn't asked about the names and numbers she'd whispered in the dark. Instead, he'd put her to work. Silence and chores. That was the language he understood. He sent her to stack kindling, to check on the animals. He kept her busy, hoping the work would build a wall between them and the questions he was too afraid to ask. She learned quickly, tending the stove, mending his worn-out shirts with neat, practiced stitches. He noticed she never let that leather satchel out of her sight. It was always slung over her shoulder or sitting on her lap. One afternoon, he was splitting logs, the axe rising and falling in a steady rhythm that helped him think. The wound in his arm was a dull, persistent ache. "Why do you live so far from everyone?" she asked. Her voice was soft, but it cut through the crisp air and the sound of the axe. He paused, the blade buried deep in a round of pine. "Quieter out here," he said, not looking at her. "Or safer," she pressed. He finally turned and met her gaze. Her eyes were an unnerving shade of gray, like a winter sky right before a storm. "Both," he said. That seemed to satisfy her. For now. But he knew the questions were piling up behind those eyes. Soon, they'd have to be answered. A week later, their supplies were running low. There was no avoiding it. They had to go to town. Dead River Junction. The name was fitting. It was a place where hope went to die. A handful of gray, weathered buildings clinging to the frozen dirt like barnacles on a forgotten ship. The ride in was silent. Jedediah rode ahead, his back straight, a silent warning to anyone who looked their way. Rosalind followed, her head held high, the mysterious satchel across her lap. The moment they rode onto the main street, the town went quiet. Men stopped what they were doing. Faces appeared in windows. It was like a switch had been flipped. Whispers followed them like smoke. He was used to the stares. They called him Cain, the killer, the hermit. He'd earned their fear, and he wore it like a second coat. But today, the stares were different. They weren't all for him. He watched as eyes flicked from him to the girl on the horse behind him, and the looks weren't just curious, they were scared. The marshal, a man named Barrett with a face like a worn-out boot, watched them from the boardwalk. He didn't smile, he just watched. A group of ranch hands leaning outside the saloon stopped talking and just stared, their smirks fading into something else. Jedediah dismounted, ignoring them all, but he could feel Rosalind's tension. Her fingers fumbled as she tied her horse to the hitching post. Inside the general store, the air was thick with the smell of coffee, leather, and unspoken questions. Miss Delaney, the owner, was a woman with eyes as sharp as tacks and a smile that never reached them. "Morning, Cain," she said, her gaze sliding right past him to Rosalind. "Brought company, I see." Jedediah just grunted and started grabbing what he needed: flour, beans, salt, the essentials. Rosalind moved through the store like a ghost, her boots silent on the creaking floorboards. He could hear the whispers start up again. "That's her," someone murmured by the pot-bellied stove. "Looks just like her mother." Her mother? Jedediah froze, his hand hovering over a sack of coffee beans. What in God's name were they talking about? Rosalind reached the counter with a few small things: a spool of thread, a cake of soap. Miss Delaney looked down at her, that fake smile plastered on her face. "Hard place for a young lady," she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "Especially one with your family's troubles." Rosalind's chin lifted. "I don't know what you mean." "Oh, I think you do," Miss Delaney said, her voice dropping. "Some debts follow you, even out here." She wrapped the soap and thread in brown paper, her movements slow and deliberate. She was sending a message, and Jedediah was starting to think it wasn't for Rosalind. It was for him. Outside, he loaded the supplies, his movements sharp and angry. His mind was racing. Her mother? Family troubles? Debts? They rode out of town in a tense, furious silence. They were miles out, with the dead town a memory behind them, before she finally spoke. "You heard them," she said. It wasn't a question. "Don't pay them no mind," he muttered, but the words sounded hollow even to him. "They think I don't belong here." "They're right," he said, his voice harsher than he meant. "This ain't a place for someone running from something. Folks get nervous." "And you?" she shot back, her voice suddenly sharp. "Do you think I don't belong?" He didn't answer. He just spurred his horse on, trying to outrun the questions. But he couldn't. He saw the way his own silence hurt her. He saw the flicker of betrayal in her eyes. That night, the cabin felt smaller, the walls closing in. He sat by the fire, cleaning his rifle, not looking at her. She was at the small table, a lantern casting a golden glow on a small, leather-bound journal he hadn't seen before. She was writing, her pen scratching furiously across the page. Finally, he couldn't take it anymore. "They don't know you," he said, his voice quiet. "They don't know what you've been through to get this far." She looked up, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "And you do?" He stared into the fire, the flames hypnotizing him. "I know enough," he said. "I know you're stronger than any of them." A strange look passed between them, a moment of understanding, but it was fleeting. The silence that followed was filled with all the secrets she was keeping, and all the ghosts he was hiding. A few days later, he found her journal. She'd left it on the table by mistake. He knew he shouldn't. It was a violation, a betrayal of the fragile trust they were building. But the need to know, the need to understand the danger she'd brought to his door, was too strong. He opened it. Her handwriting was neat, precise. The first few pages were what he expected: descriptions of the trail, the loss of her parents to a sudden sickness, the fear and the loneliness. But then the entries changed. They became frantic, coded, full of names he didn't recognize and strings of numbers, the same ones he'd heard her whispering that first night. And then he saw a name he did recognize: Clayton Reich, the man whose riders had been scouting his land just a few weeks ago. The last entry was chilling. It wasn't in code. It was a single, desperate sentence. He killed them. He killed them both. And now he's coming for me. He wants the key. Jedediah slammed the journal shut, his heart hammering in his chest. Sickness hadn't taken her parents. Reich had. The rustlers who had attacked him, the riders on the ridge, they were all connected. They were all part of Reich's gang, and they weren't after his cattle. They were hunting her. That night, as the wind howled outside, he finally told her his own story. He told her about his wife, Mara, and his son. He told her about the raiders who had come in the night, how he'd fought, how he'd killed them, but not before they. He couldn't finish. The words wouldn't come. They said I was a killer after that, he whispered, staring at the knife in his hands. They weren't wrong. But killing a man doesn't bring back what you lost. It just carves out a piece of you and leaves an empty space. Rosalind moved from the table and sat on the floor by the hearth near him. She didn't touch him. She just sat there, a silent presence in the dark. I lied to you, she said, her voice barely audible. He waited. My parents didn't die of cholera. They were murdered. His eyes lifted and met hers. Grief, recognizing grief. It was Clayton Reich, she said, the name like a curse on her lips. My father was his partner. They ran freight, some legal, some not. My father. He wasn't a good man. He skimmed from Reich for years. He was planning to leave, to take my mother and me away and start over. He kept a ledger. All of Reich's crimes. All the proof. He told me he had a key to a lockbox in a bank in another territory. Everything they'd need. Her voice broke. Reich found out. He came to our homestead. I was hiding in the root cellar. I heard everything. She took a shuddering breath. I have the key. It's in the satchel. It's all I have left. So, that was it. The surgeon's kit was a cover. The satchel held the key to Reich's destruction. And Reich knew she had it. He wasn't just a rustler. He was a man trying to bury his past, and Rosalind was the last loose end. The silence in the cabin was absolute. The fire crackled, spitting embers onto the hearth. Outside, the wind sounded like a woman weeping. Maybe that's why we don't scare each other, she whispered, her eyes locked on his. We've both already seen the worst the world has to offer. He let out a strange, choked sound that might have been a laugh. For the first time since she'd arrived, the secrets were gone. All that was left was the truth, ugly and dangerous, and the certain knowledge that Clayton Reich was coming. He wasn't coming to steal cattle. He was coming to finish a job. He was coming to kill her. And now, he'd have to come through Jedediah Kane to do it. The truth settled over the cabin like a fresh layer of snow, cold and heavy. For days, an unspoken truce held them. They didn't talk about Reich. They didn't talk about the key she kept hidden in that battered leather satchel. Instead, they fell into a routine born of necessity and a shared, silent understanding that their quiet world was living on borrowed time. Jedediah started teaching her things. not just how to mend a saddle or bake bread from their dwindling supplies. He taught her how to survive. He took her out into the pale winter light and taught her how to handle a rifle. At first, the heavy Winchester was awkward in her hands. Her shoulders ached from the recoil, but she was a fast learner. Her eyes were sharp, her hands steady. She listened to everything he said, her expression serious, focused. He'd set up old tins on a fence post 50 yards out. "Breathe out slow," he'd say, his voice a low rumble beside her. "Don't jerk the trigger, squeeze it. Become the rifle." Plink, a miss. Again. Plink, another miss. She got frustrated, her cheeks flushing. "I can't." "You can," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "You patched up a bullet wound on a man you'd just met in the middle of a blizzard. You can do this." She took a deep breath, set her jaw, and raised the rifle again. She breathed out, slow and steady. She squeezed. Ping. The can jumped off the post and spun through the air. A slow smile spread across her face, a rare and brilliant thing. He felt something shift inside him, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. He was seeing the woman she was becoming, forged in loss and fear, and she was stronger than he could have imagined. In the evenings, she would read to him from her journal, not the coded, frantic parts, but the stories of her childhood. A stray dog she'd rescued, the first time she'd seen the mountains. Small, simple memories that painted a picture of a life before it had been shattered. He, in turn, told her stories of his own, of the son who loved to fish, of the wife who could make wildflowers grow in the hard, unforgiving soil. They were trading ghosts, letting the memories out into the warm cabin air so they didn't have to carry them alone anymore. The fragile peace couldn't last. The thaw came, slow at first, then all at once. The world started to weep, water running in tiny rivulets under the shrinking snow. The air lost its bite, and with the thaw came a new kind of tension. Reich wasn't a fool. He wouldn't have attacked in the dead of winter. He would have waited for the melt, for the ground to harden enough for a full-scale assault. They both knew it. The unspoken knowledge hung between them every day. One morning, Jedediah was out checking the fence line. The ground was soft, muddy, and there, pressed deep into the earth, were fresh tracks. A single rider, the hoof prints were clear. The horse had been shod by a blacksmith who favored a particular kind of nail. Jedediah knew that work. It was one of Reich's men, a scout. They were getting closer. He rode back to the cabin, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. He found Rosalind in the small patch of ground beside the cabin, turning the cold, stubborn soil with a trowel. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Planting herbs," she said, not looking up. "The ones in my kit are almost gone." "They won't take," he said, his voice gruff. "Ground's still too cold, it's a waste of time." "Then I'll keep trying until they do," she shot back, a flash of defiance in her eyes. She was refusing to give up, refusing to believe that there was no future to plant for. That night, he couldn't sleep. He sat by the window, the rifle across his lap, watching the moonlit landscape. He was watching for riders, but he was also thinking about her, about the hope she carried inside her like a stubborn flame. He thought about his own life, a long, dark road of loss and vengeance. He'd told himself he was protecting his solitude, but he knew the truth. He was hiding. He was a coward, afraid to let anyone in, because everyone he'd ever loved had been taken from him. He heard a floorboard creak behind him. "You can't watch forever," she said softly. "He'll come when he comes." "I know," he said, his eyes still fixed on the darkness outside. "When he does," she said, her voice steady, "I'll be ready. You taught me how." He finally turned to look at her. She was standing there in the moonlight, filtering through the window, her expression serious. She wasn't a girl anymore. Winter had burned that away. She was a woman who had seen the worst of the world and had decided to plant a garden anyway. "Rosalind," he started, his voice thick with emotions he couldn't name. "This isn't your fight. You should take the horse. Ride south. Don't stop." "And go where, Jedediah?" she asked, her voice quiet but unyielding. "To another town full of whispers? To a life of looking over my shoulder? I've been running my whole life. I'm tired of running." She took a step closer. "My father ran. He took Reich's money and their secrets, and he ran. And what did it get him? A shallow grave, and a daughter left with nothing but a key to a life she can never have. I won't be him." The conviction in her voice stunned him. She was choosing to stay, choosing to face the man who had destroyed her family, not for revenge, but for the right to stop running. "This place?" she said, her gaze sweeping around the small, rough cabin. "This is the first place I've felt safe since they died. Because of you." He felt his carefully constructed walls crumble. For years, he'd believed his hands were only good for one thing: ending lives. But she was telling him he'd saved hers, that this broken-down cabin, this monument to his own failure and grief, had been her sanctuary. He reached out, his calloused, scarred hand hesitating in the air between them. He wanted to touch her, to tell her, what? That he was terrified of losing her? That her stubborn hope was more terrifying than Reich's entire gang? He let his hand drop. "Wanting things is dangerous," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "It gives them something to take from you." "Then let them try," she whispered, her eyes blazing in the moonlight. "We'll be waiting." A few days later, they had to go back to Dead River Junction. They were almost out of ammunition. The ride in was different this time. They rode side by side. The whispers still followed them, but Jedediah didn't care. He watched Rosalind, who kept her head high, meeting the stares of the townsfolk with a calm defiance that made his chest ache with a fierce, protective pride. Marshal Barrett met them on the boardwalk. "Kane," he said, tipping his hat, "heard Reich's been sniffing around your land." "He's not sniffing," Jedediah said, his voice flat. "He's hunting." Barrett's eyes flickered to Rosalind. "This is a bad business, son. A feud between men like you and Reich. It's no place for a girl." "I'm not a girl," Rosalind said, her voice clear and strong, loud enough for the onlookers to hear. "And I'm not caught in the middle of anything. I chose my side." The marshal looked at her, really looked at her, for a long moment. He saw the steel in her spine. He gave a slow nod. "Well, God help you then. Both of you." As they were leaving the general store, stocked with bullets and grim resolve, Miss Delaney stopped them. Her usual sneer was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like fear. "He was here," she whispered, her eyes wide. "Clayton Reich. He was in town this morning, asking questions about her." Jedediah's blood went cold. "What did you tell him?" "Nothing," she said, holding up her hands. "Nothing, I swear. But he knows she's with you. He said he was coming to collect what was his." The ride back to the cabin was a blur. The unspoken threat was now a promise. Reich wasn't just coming, he was close. That evening, as the sun began to set, casting long, bloody streaks across the sky, Jedediah saw a flicker of movement on the far ridge. Not a single scout this time. A group of riders. They sat on their horses, black silhouettes against the dying sun, watching the cabin. They were sending a message. "We're here. We see you. There's nowhere left to run." Rosalind came to stand beside him on the porch, her own rifle in her hand. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. They stood there together, watching the shadows lengthen, waiting for the night to fall, the siege to come. "This fight isn't yours," he said one last time, a desperate final plea. She looked at him, her face illuminated by the last rays of sunlight. "It is if I choose it," she said. And in her eyes he saw not fear, but a fierce, unwavering love. A love for the home they had built, for the broken man who had saved her, and for the future she was willing to die for. The dusk swallowed his answer, and Jedediah Kane, the man who had lost everything, knew he had one last thing to fight for. The dawn was a cruel joke. It rose thin and coppery, the kind of light that promised blood. Jedediah had been awake all night, every nerve screaming. He stood on the porch, his rifle feeling like a natural extension of his arm. The world was quiet, too quiet. Every sound was magnified. The nervous snort of his horse in the barn, the creak of a floorboard inside the cabin. He could feel the coming violence in the air, like the pressure before a lightning strike. Beside him, Rosalind moved with a chilling calm. Her face was pale, but her hands were steady as she checked the ammunition in her own rifle for the 10th time. He had tried one last time in the dark hours before morning to send her away. He'd pleaded with her, begged her to take the horse and run. She had simply looked at him and said, "My home is here now. I don't run from my home." What could he say to that? What right did he have to deny her the courage she had fought so hard to find? He hated her strength in that moment, because it meant she would stay. He loved her for it, because it meant he wouldn't die alone. They came with the first light, just as he knew they would. They weren't shadows on the horizon this time. They were a tide of darkness, pouring over the ridge. 10 men, maybe more, all hard-faced and armed to the teeth. At their head rode Clayton Reich. He was a hawk of a man, lean and predatory, with a grin that was more a scar than an expression of humor. Jedediah felt the old rage, the familiar killer instinct, rise up in him. It was a cold, clean feeling. But beneath it was a hot, desperate terror, the terror of having something to lose again. He had positioned Rosalind behind a heavy woodpile near the porch, a makeshift barricade. "Stay down," he ordered, his voice a low growl. "Don't shoot unless they breach the porch." "And if they shoot at you?" she asked, her voice impossibly steady. "Then don't miss," he said, and he meant it. Reich's gang pulled up 100 yards out, their horses stamping and snorting in the cold air. "Kane!" Reich's voice carried, sharp and mocking. "I heard you took in a stray. I've come to claim my property." Jedediah stepped out from the cover of the porch, his boots crunching on the hard-packed dirt. He stood there alone, a big man against an army, his face an unreadable mask of stone. "She ain't your property, Reich," he called back, his voice like rolling thunder. "And this ain't your land. Turn around and ride away, and you might live to see another sunrise." Laughter rippled through Reich's men. "Brave words, old man," Reich shouted. "But I'm not here for the land. I'm here for what your little pet stole from me. Give me the girl and the key, and I'll let you keep your miserable life." Jedediah's eyes narrowed. "You try to set one foot on this porch, Reich," he said, his voice dropping to a deadly calm, "and I will personally send you to hell." There was a beat of perfect, ringing silence. The world held its breath. Then Reich spat on the ground, and all hell broke loose. The first shot wasn't from Reich's men. It was from Jedediah. He had his rifle up and fired in a single, fluid motion. One of the riders clutched his chest and toppled from his saddle before he'd even cleared his pistol from its holster. The air exploded into a storm of gunfire. Bullets tore through the air with angry whines. Wood splintered from the porch posts. Horses screamed and reared. Men shouted curses. Rosalind crouched behind the woodpile, her heart hammering against her ribs. She forced herself to breathe. Slow in, slow out. Just like he'd taught her. Jedediah moved with the deadly grace of a cornered wolf. He fired, ducked behind a rain barrel, and fired again. Each shot was deliberate, precise. A man went down, clutching his leg. Another's hat was blown clean off his head. But there were too many of them. They were fanning out, trying to flank the cabin. A bullet grazed his arm, a hot, searing line of pain. Another slammed into the rain barrel, sending a spray of water and splinters into the air. He swore, reloaded, and kept firing. From her position, Rosalind saw it. A man, moving low and fast, circling around the side of the barn. He was trying to get a clear shot at Jedediah's back. Time seemed to slow down. Her training kicked in. She lifted her rifle, the stock solid against her shoulder. She found the man in her sights. She breathed out. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her, the sound deafening. The man cried out and dropped, his own rifle clattering to the ground. A wave of nausea and shock washed over her. She had just shot a man. Then a cold, hard resolve replaced it. She reloaded, her hands shaking but her eyes clear. She was in this fight. The battle raged. It was chaos and smoke and the constant, deafening roar of guns. Jedediah felt his strength starting to fade. The wound in his side from the first rustler attack had reopened, and his shirt was turning a dark, sticky red. But he held his ground, fueled by a primal need to protect the woman behind him. Then Reich made his move. He charged forward on his horse, his pistol blazing. "You're getting slow, old man," he screamed, his face contorted in a mask of rage. A bullet clipped Jedediah's shoulder. The impact was like being hit with a sledgehammer. Pain, white-hot and blinding, exploded through him. He stumbled, his vision blurring. "Jed!" Rosalind's cry cut through the noise. She stood up from behind the woodpile and fired, not even seeming to aim. The shot was wild, but it forced Reich to swerve his horse, giving Jedediah the 1 second he needed. He dove behind the porch steps, gasping for breath, trying to clear his head. The tide was turning against them. Reich was regrouping his men for another charge. They were going to be overrun. "Rosalind!" he yelled. "The satchel! The key!" "What?" she cried back, her face smudged with gunpowder. "It's not about the ledger!" he gasped, the pain making it hard to speak. "Your father told you wrong. He was a coward, but he wasn't a fool. The key isn't for a lockbox." He saw the confusion on her face. "He knew Reich would come for him. He planned for it." He took a ragged breath. "The key isn't for a bank. It's for the old mining company's dynamite storage up in the hills. He rigged it. He rigged the whole damn shed to blow." Her eyes went wide with dawning, horrified understanding. Her father hadn't left her a fortune. He'd left her a weapon of last resort, a suicide bomb. Reich and his men were advancing again, moving slower this time, more cautiously. They were almost to the porch. "There's no ledger, is there?" she whispered, the terrible truth hitting her. "No," Jedediah said, his voice grim. "There never was. Your father's only plan was to take Reich with him if he got caught. He just never got the chance to turn the key. They were trapped. Reich was going to kill them both, and the secret weapon she'd been guarding with her life was a useless bluff, miles away up in the hills." The hope in her eyes died, replaced by a bleak despair. They were going to die here. Reich was on the porch now, his grin triumphant. He leveled his pistol at Jedediah's head. "It's over, Kane." Suddenly, a new sound cut through the air. Not gunfire. Hoofbeats. A lot of them, coming fast from the direction of town. Reich spun around, his eyes wide with disbelief. A posse of riders was cresting the hill, Marshal Barrett at their head. They were armed and riding hard. For a second, no one moved. The world was frozen. Then Barrett raised his pistol and fired into the air. "Clayton Reich," he bellowed. "You and your men are under arrest for murder and cattle rustling. Drop your weapons." Reich stared, his face a mixture of fury and confusion. His men looked at each other, panicked. They were caught between Jedediah's rifle and a full-blown posse. Reich made his choice. He wasn't going to be taken alive. He swung his pistol back towards Jedediah, but he never got the shot off. A single rifle crack echoed from the cabin window. Not from the woodpile. From the window. Reich's triumphant grin vanished, replaced by a look of stunned surprise. He looked down at the red flower blooming on his chest. He staggered back, his pistol falling from his hand, and tumbled off the porch into the dirt. He was dead before he landed. Jedediah looked up at the window and saw Miss Delaney from the general store, an old hunting rifle in her hands, smoke curling from the barrel. Her face was pale but determined. She and the marshal and the rest of the town had come. They hadn't come for him. They had come for Rosalind. The fight was over. The remaining members of Reich's gang threw down their guns, their hands in the air. The silence that fell was profound, broken only by the ringing in Jedediah's ears. He leaned back against the porch, the strength finally leaving him. Rosalind was at his side in an instant, her hands fluttering over his wounds, her face a mask of terror and relief. "You're bleeding," she said, tears finally streaming down her cheeks. "Not the first time," he managed to rasp, a faint smile touching his lips. He looked past her at the townspeople dismounting, at the marshal clapping his men in irons, at Miss Delaney walking towards them, her face grim. He had been wrong about them all. About the town, about Rosalind, about himself. The world, he was beginning to realize, wasn't just made of teeth. It was also made of stubborn, improbable hope. And it was a hope that had just saved his life. The aftermath was a slow, strange dream. Jedediah drifted in and out of consciousness, the world a blur of faces and hushed voices. He remembered Marshal Barrett standing over him, a grim look on his face. "You're a damn tough fool, Kane, but you're a lucky one." He remembered Miss Delaney, her sharp eyes softened with something that looked like respect, pressing a bottle of laudanum to his lips. Most of all, he remembered Rosalind. She never left his side. Her touch was a constant, gentle presence. She cleaned his wounds, changed his bandages, and spooned broth into his mouth. He would wake in the dead of night, feverish and in pain, and she would be there, a cool cloth on his forehead, her quiet strength a lighthouse in his storm of pain. The town, it turned out, had a conscience after all. When Reich had ridden through, boasting that he was going to wipe out Kane and the girl he was harboring, something had shifted. Maybe it was Rosalind's defiance in the store. Maybe it was the marshal's nagging sense of duty. Or maybe they were just tired of living in fear of a man like Reich. Whatever it was, they had chosen a side. The story came out in pieces. Rosalind, sitting by his bedside, finally told the marshal the whole truth. About her father, the stolen money, and the lie about the ledger. The only thing she left out was the key. She told them it had been lost on the trail, a final act of severing herself from her father's dark legacy. The key was still in the satchel, a useless piece of metal that had almost gotten them killed, but she couldn't bring herself to throw it away just yet. As Jedediah healed, the cabin changed. The townspeople started visiting. They brought food, fresh bread, jars of preserves, a whole smoked ham. They brought supplies and offered to help mend the bullet-riddled barn. They were awkward and shy about it, these people who had once whispered about him behind their hands. It was their way of apologizing, their way of saying they had misjudged him. He didn't know what to do with their kindness. It felt foreign, like a language he'd forgotten how to speak. But Rosalind knew. She accepted their gifts with a quiet grace, her gratitude healing the rift between the lonely cabin and the wary town. Winter finally surrendered, its icy grip replaced by the gentle warmth of a true spring. The land came alive with color. Rosalind's herb garden, the one he'd said would never grow, was thriving. Tiny green shoots pushed their way through the dark earth, a stubborn testament to her hope. Jedediah was slower now. The wounds had left their mark, a permanent limp, a stiffness in his shoulder. But the changes went deeper than that. The hardness in his eyes was gone, replaced by a quiet watchfulness. He spent his days on the porch, watching Rosalind work in her garden, watching the life she was coaxing from the soil. He watched her talk to the horse, her voice soft and musical. He watched her as she stood in the evening light, her hair catching the golden glow of the setting sun. And he knew, with a certainty that both terrified and thrilled him, that he was in love with her. He had spent years building walls around his heart, convinced that loving someone was a death sentence. But this woman, this slip of a girl who had walked out of a blizzard and into his life, had torn them down without even trying. She had fought beside him, healed him, and shown him that he was more than the ghosts he carried. But he was an old man, scarred inside and out. And she was young, with her whole life ahead of her. A life she deserved to live far away from this place of blood and memory. One evening, the air was soft and smelled of damp earth and new leaves. Rosalind came and sat on the porch steps near his chair. They sat in a comfortable silence for a long time, watching the stars begin to appear in the twilight sky. "You've been quiet," she said gently. "Thinking," he replied. "About what?" He took a deep breath. "This place, it was never meant to hold anyone but me. It's a place for endings, Rosalind, not beginnings." "You're wrong," she said, turning to look at him. "It wasn't an ending for me. It was the first place I ever felt like I could breathe. It kept me alive." His heart ached. "You deserve more than this. More than an old man with a limp and a piece of land people have died over." "I deserve to choose," she said, her voice firm, the same fire in her eyes he'd seen the day she'd stood up to the marshal. "And I'm choosing this. I'm choosing you." He turned to face her, the weight of all his years, all his losses pressing down on him. "Rosalind, I have buried a wife and a son. I can't ask you to tie your future to a man like me. I can't promise you'll be safe." She stood up and walked over to him, her boots silent on the wooden porch. She knelt down in front of his chair so they were eye to eye. "You don't have to promise me safety, Jedediah," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "You've already given me something better. You taught me how to be brave. You taught me how to stand and fight when all I knew how to do was run." Her hand came up and gently touched the scar on his cheek. "You think your scars make you weak, but they don't. They prove you survived." His throat felt tight, the words locked inside. A tear, the first he'd shed in 20 years, escaped and traced a path through the dust on his cheek. She took his rough, scarred hands in hers. "I know I'm too young," she said, a small, brave smile on her face. "And I know you're stubborn as a mule. But I'm going to marry you, Jedediah Kane." The words hit him like a physical blow. Every instinct he had screamed at him to say no, to push her away, to save her from himself. But then he saw it all again. The lost girl in the snow, the fierce woman firing a rifle in his defense, the gentle nurse who had brought him back from the brink, the gardener who could make life grow from barren ground. She wasn't a fragile thing he needed to protect. She was his equal. She was the other half of his broken soul. Slowly, painfully, he pushed himself out of the chair and lowered himself down onto one knee. It wasn't a grand gesture. It was an act of surrender. "If you'll have a man," he said, his voice rough and cracking with emotion, "who is only just learning how to live again, then yes. Yes, Rosalind." She laughed through her own tears, a sound so full of joy it seemed to make the stars shine brighter. He pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair, and for the first time in a lifetime, the ghosts were silent. The emptiness inside him was filled. The past would always be a part of him, a landscape of scars he would carry forever. But love, he finally understood, wasn't about finding someone who could erase the past. It was about finding someone who was willing to stand with you in the shadows and gently lead you back into the light. If you believe that even the deepest wounds can heal and that everyone deserves a second chance at happiness, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss the stories we have coming.